Well, Ampetu Washte. Good day, everyone. Like Hannah mentioned, my name is Leya Charles. I'm the Water Assessment and Impaired Waters List Coordinator for the Pollution Control Agency. And welcome to number 4 of 5 meetings we're having about this draft Impaired Waters List for 2024. Today, we are going to talk about some of our statewide assessments that we have done. And we've already dove in deep to some different watershed assessments over the course of this last week. So all of those are going to be posted on the website with those recordings, and you can find them there. So the Clean Water Act, being a federal act through the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, does require states and tribal nations with treatment as a state to develop standards to protect our designated uses. You know, our uses being the goals of what we want to be able to use that water body for, that lake or that stream or that wetland. And then the Act also requires us to develop a list of the waters that don't meet those standards. And that is what we call our impaired waters list, right? And this is by no means all of what the Clean Water Act requires states to do. You know, there are a lot of other aspects of the Act as far as protecting and restoring our waters. This is just a piece of it. And, you know, the Clean Water Act was established in 1972, and I think it's a fun fact that I like to share is that the Pollution Control Agency was actually established 5 years before that, which really just, to me, is evidence of how much Minnesotans truly care about protecting and restoring our water bodies. So in conjunction with the Impaired Waters List, we also have our Assessment Guidance Manual. The Impaired Waters List being that wonderful spreadsheet, that's the extensive list, and the guidance manual being that PDF document that outlines all of our methods of how we do our assessments to determine if something is impaired. So both of those kind of go together, and we'll talk more about those as we go along. So let's chat a little bit about the assessments we do that then feed into the Impaired Waters List, right? So we have, you know, established in 2010 with the Clean Water Fund, a watershed approach. So there being 80 different watersheds all throughout Minnesota, every year picking out some of those watersheds and really diving in deep with aquatic life and aquatic recreation uses and comparing those standards for those watersheds. And then within 10 years, we have gone through and assessed and listed waters for the entire state. And we've already done that. We've already gone through a whole 10-year cycle and assessed all of the watersheds. So now we're going back through a second time and assessing those watersheds again, which is really important to evaluate changes, to see if there's any, you know, new parameters that have come on the books that we need to evaluate as well. So in this list cycle, you know, the Impaired Waters List being cumulative, we have assessed 8 different watersheds in these last 2 years. So these are the ones that we focused on, highlighted in red, over the course of this last week, diving into those watershed assessments, being over 2,000 different water bodies that we assessed in these last couple of years to make some modifications and changes to the list. And today we're going to be talking about our statewide assessments. So that's our approach for, you know, more toxic type pollutants, things like fish tissue contaminants and pesticides, nitrate, sulfate, PFAS in fish tissue. That's what we're going to be chatting about here today, is those statewide assessments. And so that is every 2 years in conjunction with submittal of the Impaired Waters List. We are going through the entire state, all of those 80 watersheds, taking any data that's available and evaluating against the standards for these pollutants. And that is so that, you know, we're not waiting for 10 years to go back to that watershed to reevaluate. We're able to really get this updated every 2 years for these types of things that affect human health. So it's really good to keep in context our designated uses. Our designated uses, you might also hear it called beneficial uses. and those being the goals of what we want to use that water body for, that lake or that stream or that wetland, because the impaired waters list is all about surface water, right? And so this is a smattering of some of our designated uses for those water bodies. There's different standards that protect different uses, because there's different standards that, you know, fish or bugs or critters in the water might need to stay healthy versus what humans might need to stay healthy. So for every single water body that we're looking at, we're evaluating according to what uses we have designated that we would like them to meet. And today, we're going to be talking more about the impairments for those these two designated uses: aquatic consumption, so eating and consuming fish, and then wild rice protection, so sulfate. Okay, so that's a little about, just briefly, our assessments that feed into the impaired waters list, a little bit about the uses of how we evaluate what standards apply to which water body. And I wanted to make note that the impaired waters list is cumulative. And so any water body that was listed in the 2022 impaired waters list might still be listed in this impaired waters list, unless there's new data that has come in to show that, oh, it's now meeting that standard. It's now meeting that goal, that designated use for our water body, and we can, what we call, delist it. And so any waters that are not supporting their beneficial uses are on the impaired waters list. And it's just one tool of many that we can use to kind of evaluate how well our lakes and our streams meet those goals, right? So our impaired waters list, this draft list, does have over 6,000 different impairments over almost 3,000 different water bodies. And so when you're looking at those numbers, good to remember that, oh, you know, because we have multiple different designated uses on one water body, it can have multiple different impairments associated with that. So that's why you're seeing those two numbers being kind of different there. So we're not going to spend a ton of time talking today about mercury, but being that mercury in fish tissue is a statewide assessment, it's good to mention. Here on this pie chart, you can find it on the impaired waters list, being that wonderful spreadsheet that we all know and love. If you click over in the tabs, you can find this pie chart in the summary tab. And what I wanted to point out here is mercury being an air pollutant that can get into our waterways through precipitation and dry deposition. You know, it does accumulate in fish tissue. And as you can see from this chart, over a quarter of all of those over 6,000 impairments on the impaired waters list are due to mercury. And so when you're pulling up that impaired waters viewer, that map, and you're seeing a lot of red throughout the state, a lot of that is due to mercury. And so just remember, when you're looking at your water body and thinking back towards what is that designated use for my water body? Am I wanting to swim in it? You can still swim in it if it's impaired from mercury. Am I wanting to fish in it? You can still fish in it if it's impaired from mercury, but you want to follow those Minnesota Department of Health safe fish consumption guidelines. So of that 27%, you know, most of those mercury impairments do fall under our statewide mercury TMDL, a TMDL being, you know, the pollution budget for our water body. And so when we have met the goals for those TMDL reductions, 73% of our waters will end up meeting those goals for mercury. So wanted to make note of that. So new on this draft list, we did get some more data in for mercury in fish tissue that does have 3 new streams that weren't on the 2022 list and 20 lakes that weren't on that list for mercury in fish tissue. And most of those, like I mentioned, 17 of them are all within that typical range seen in Minnesota. So already on the statewide mercury TMDL to have some pollutant reductions achieved. So that's a bunch about mercury. I also wanted to touch on, there are some encouraging things happening with pesticides. We got some new data in showing for chlorpyrifos, in these statewide assessments that we have 7 different assessment units that are being delisted or taken off the list for chlorpyrifos. You know, that requires 5 years of having no detections of that pesticide in those waters. So that's awesome. So our 2 big topics today are going to be focusing on PFAS in fish and sulfate in wild rice producing waters. So first, let's pivot and talk about PFAS in fish. So PFAS, what is it? You know, you'll hear a lot of times it being called a forever chemical because it does have extremely strong chemical bonds that make it hard to break down. You know, it's a very strongly bonded compound. And there's thousands of different compounds that are under this kind of category of these PFAS substances, right? And so PFAS with an O is one form of a PFAS compound that does bioaccumulate in fish tissue. And so that is what we evaluate for in the impaired waters list, is we are evaluating against that state criteria for PFAS. And again, it's important to remember in our beneficial uses, in our designated uses, of the use of a water body. So because it's impaired for PFAS for fish consumption, doesn't necessarily mean that it's impaired for aquatic recreation. So it's good to keep that in mind. So, you know, the Pollution Control Agency is one of several different state agencies that is working on this issue. And so there is a lot of research being done to collect fish tissue throughout the state for any of these bioaccumulative pollutants, meaning mercury, PCBs, PFAS. And so mostly those areas are being focused on where people would typically fish, species of fish that people typically eat. And all of that data then feeds into our assessments and our impaired waters list. And we do have some new funding for expanded monitoring beginning in 2024. So what you've all been waiting for, right? So what did we actually find as we did our statewide assessments of PFAS in fish tissue? Well, we found that there are 3 waters that were not listed before for an impairment for PFAS in fish tissue. Those being Sargent Creek and Miller Creek up in the Duluth area and Crystal Lake in the Robbinsdale area. So then what? Something's listed as being impaired for PFAS on the impaired waters list. What happens next, right? So there are an extensive amount of work being done for PFAS throughout the state with many different state agencies. And you can find a lot of that outlined in Minnesota's PFAS blueprint. If you just search that on the web, you'll find it. And this is just listing out just a couple examples of some of the things that are in that blueprint. A lot of collaborative efforts to address PFAS, being that it's a bigger and broader issue than something that a TMDL can address. And so, you know, there are some prohibitions in place as far as the use of products containing PFAS, such as, you know, firefighting foam, things like, you know, a rain jacket, because PFAS is a very useful component and compound that repels oil, that repels water. So if you would like to know more about this, check out that PFAS blueprint. Read more about Amara's law phasing out that non-essential use of PFAS. Okay, so that's a bunch on PFAS. We're going to take a hard pivot and talk about wild rice and the sulfate standard. So monomen, pitene, wild rice is an extremely important plant, right? It is also our state grain in Minnesota. Whenever I have folks come in that haven't visited Minnesota, I always make sure they get a bowl of wild rice soup, classic. And Minnesota is really unique in that we have a standard on the books, a water quality standard to protect wild rice that was adopted in 1973. And that standard does outline here that it is 10 milligrams per liter, applicable to water used for production of wild rice during periods when the rice may be susceptible to damage by high sulfate levels. So as we're going through and evaluating all of our waters with this standard, it's important to note, okay, well, where are those designated uses? Where are those beneficial uses for the production of wild rice, right? Where does that sulfate standard apply? Because there's also different standards for sulfate according to different designated uses. So the Pollution Control Agency did compile a list of about 2,400 waters based on a number of different sources. And that list is demonstrating, where we are designating the beneficial use of producing wild rice. Those waters have documented wild rice stands, whether or not how many plants there are in there, whether they're robust or sparse. There's documentation to show there's wild rice there. Or there was documentation to show there was wild rice there since the standard was on the books. So it can either have an existing use, you can physically see rice there, or it may have the potential to support that use. There has been rice there in the past. And so that whole 2,400 waters list of where we are designating that beneficial use is outlined in our assessment guidance manual. Now let's refresh. Our assessment guidance manual is that manual and document that's also listed on our Impaired Waters List website up for public comment that details out our assessment methods. How are we evaluating the waters against the standards? What are our data minimums? What are our requirements in order to decide if we have enough data to show that something's impaired or not? And that's listed out for all the parameters that are applicable in the Impaired Waters List, including sulfate. And so you can find all that in our guidance manual. It was reformatted this year, so it will be hopefully much easier for you to find the information that you want to find in it. But what's new this year to the guidance manual is that Appendix H, is that list of waters used for the production of wild rice. And because this is a PDF and you have to scroll to find what you're looking for, you'll also find linked in the manual a viewing tool. And so it's a map, and you can go ahead and check out that waters used for production of wild rice. And that is linked both in the guidance manual as well as on our Protecting Wild Rice Waters webpage. So go ahead and use that tool as well. Okay, so we talked a little bit about where does the standard apply? Where do we have those uses? Now, what did we actually find as we did this statewide assessment? Well, as I mentioned, it's about 2,400 waters, so it's specifically 2,396 assessment units. And what I mean by an assessment unit is you might have a really long stream, and maybe only a chunk of it is designated as a water used for production of wild rice. And that's pretty typical how we design all of our other designated uses, right? The entirety of the Mississippi River isn't a drinking water source, but portions of it are. And this picture here is actually a picture from where I harvested rice this year from Hay Creek. And so, with example of Hay Creek, there's only a chunk of it that has wild rice in it. So as we did our sweep of data, we found 597 different units that we assessed for wild rice that we actually had data on. We could actually say something about it. 504 of those were lakes, 92 of those were streams or stream segments, and one of them being a wetland. So as we evaluated all of those 597 different chunks of water bodies, we did find that there was 20 of them that did have high sulfate that didn't meet the standard, and we proposed to list as impaired. So 13 different lakes and 7 different streams. And upon approval of the list, this would bring us up to a total of 55 different assessment units that would be impaired for sulfate. And you can see them highlighted and outlined there on the map. The red being all of them that are listed on this draft list as impaired, lakes and streams. And then the blue showing that waters used for production of wild rice, those are all the areas where that designated use is assigned. So this would bring us up to a total of 33 lakes and 22 stream segments impaired for sulfate. So where do we go from here once something's listed as impaired, right? So when you have a pollutant and a designated use as impaired on the impaired waters list, it's then required to have a TMDL written. And with a lot of things, like with PFAS and with sulfate, there are more expensive efforts being taken besides just a potential future TMDL in order to help meet those goals and those designated uses. So MPCA is implementing the standard in our regulatory programs. And I wanted to make special note here as we dive into the next topic of our public comment period on what are the things we're looking at that we'd like to hear from you. And we'd really like any information about waters that you think should be on this waters used for production of wild rice list. Those will be, reviewed and considered for inclusion in our future updates of this beneficial use designation. And we plan to do that in our next impaired waters list, which will be in 2026, because every 2 years. And any more information on implementing the standard and regulatory programs can be found on our Protecting Wild Rice Waters webpage. There are some webinars that have been held about that strategy. Okay, so talked about public comment. How do you public comment? So right now we are in our public comment period. It's open until January 12th. After that, we will be going through reviewing and responding to comments and making updates to the impaired waters list as appropriate with any new information that comes in. And then the final list will be submitted to the EPA by April 1st. And then the EPA has 30 days to approve or disapprove the list, and that is when it will become final and replace our 2022 list. So that's why we keep referencing this list as being draft right now. So things that you can comment on during this public comment period is the list itself, that wonderful, glorious, beautiful spreadsheet, as well as Appendix A, which is one of the tabs in that spreadsheet that has the info for the statewide mercury TMDL, all of the water bodies that are under that TMDL. So that's the list itself. And then secondly, we have that guidance manual. And particularly, we're looking for any comments on Appendix H, on those waters used for production of wild rice. So our tool this year that we are using makes it super nice, easier than ever to comment on the draft list. All you need to do is go to that Impaired Waters List website where all this info is, scroll down and click Comment Now. That'll tab you over to a new browser tab, and you can type your comment straight in the text box. You can link spreadsheets, you can link letters, you can link photographs, you can link any documentation that would help support whatever comment it is that you are submitting. And then once you click submit, you can go ahead and scroll down and click view comments to make sure that everything was submitted. You can also see other people's comments there. So that's how you can go ahead and get some public comment in. We also have all of our watershed-based regional meetings. Those recordings will be made available on our website, on our Impaired Waters List website. And we do have one more meeting coming up. That's a statewide meeting next Tuesday at 6 p.m. And wanted to note for you that that is the same content that I just presented here today. So you are definitely welcome to come and join and ask more questions, but don't feel like you're going to miss anything. You've already heard what we're going to be presenting in that. So that was a lot of information and a lot to go into. We will have good time for questions, but I wanted to leave you with a couple takeaways if you're wondering, how does this apply to me? What do I need to get out of this whole presentation? So, it's really important to note that Minnesota monitors more often and in more places than other states due to the Clean Water Fund. And so when you're pulling up maps of other states' impaired waters lists, and you might be comparing them to our impaired waters list or impaired waters list viewer, Good to keep that in mind is that we are doing so much more data collection and we are looking for pollutant problems. And when we're finding those, then we're being transparent and outlining them on our list. And so just because we have a bigger, more extensive list doesn't necessarily mean that Minnesota's waters are worse off than other states. It means we're out looking for problems and listing those problems. And then also good to remember that it takes time for restoration to occur and get delisted. So as you might have heard in the press release, we have a lot less new impairments that we're listing this year as compared to other years. And it's just as important to keep waters off the impaired waters list as it is to be taking them off and getting them delisted. So good to note that. And then finally, always remember those designated uses, those beneficial uses. So when you are looking up, you're going to a different lake on a different cabin and you're wondering what's going on, keep in mind that aquatic consumption advisory doesn't mean a swimming advisory. So keep in mind what it is you're using that water body for. All right, Wopida, thank you very much. That's all the main content I have for you today. If you have any questions that we can't answer here today, you can go ahead and send them to that impaired.waters.mpca. That email goes straight to me and I can get you connected with any folks who can answer those questions. We have some people on the line here can help me answer questions as well. And that QR code will take you to the public comment period. So thanks. We can go ahead and open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Leah. As a reminder, folks, just use the reaction button at the bottom. Raise your hand, give a thumbs up, however you want. We'll call on you and get your question answered.
No one with burning questions?
And as Leah mentioned, if a question comes to you afterwards, or maybe a question comes up once you're looking through the list, formulating your comments, do reach out. We will follow up with as much or as little information as you would like. I'll give it just a little bit more here. Do a last call for any questions. Okay, I do see our participant list is getting slightly smaller. Folks look like they're ready to hop off here. So I suppose we'll wrap it up there then. But again, if you have any questions, just follow up with us. And you can also come to the next meeting too, if you would like to then ask your question then. So we really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you to Leya for all that great information. And we will go ahead and conclude today's meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you.